Welcome to the Pioneer Podcast. This is Ernst Roots, and in today's episode, I want to share with you a story about South Africa, about communism, about a man named Joe Slovo, and more precisely, how Joe Slovo saved communism. The Berlin Wall was generally celebrated as a sign that communism had been defeated. Some describe this as the triumph of liberalism, others of capitalism. Western media ran with headlines such as "Communism, rest in peace." Upon receiving the news, Robert Heilbroner, outspoken socialist of the New York New School for Social Research, raised his champagne with a victory toast to capitalism. Mainstream interpretation of this event tended to frame political theory as a choice between two options, liberalism and communism, and that the former has now triumphed over the latter. This was when Francis Fukuyama famously wrote The End of History, proclaiming that the world would eventually standardize on liberal democracy. And when the American President George H.W. Bush proclaimed that a new world order has emerged in which the rule of law would supplant the law of the jungle. It was also in response to this that the South African President and National Party or NP leader F.W. de Klerk decided to initiate negotiations with the African National Congress, or ANC, for a new democratic South Africa. The ANC was aligned with the South African Communist Party, or the SACP, as a result of which it was declared an illegal organization under the Suppression of Communism Act of 1950. Without consulting with the party's leadership or the cabinet, de Klerk unilaterally decided to withdraw the bulk of apartheid legislation and to release leaders of the ANC and other aligned institutions imprisoned for sabotage and treason, including Nelson Mandela. The time for negotiations has arrived, he declared. This decision was sparked by the collapse of the Soviet Union and the belief that this would render the ANC much weaker than it had been during the 1980s. Faith in the future of the National Party and the decline in support for communist-aligned movements was so strong that the NP inner circle speculated that de Klerk would probably remain president after the ANC and its allies were allowed to participate in elections. In other words, that de Klerk would probably defeat Nelson Mandela in a national election. This is because the SACP, or the South African Communist Party, has been the vanguard of the ANC, presenting ideological and intellectual leadership to the movement in its struggle against the white minority government. Even though the SACP had less support in the ANC, it was able to assume this role as a result of the support it had opened up from the Soviet Union as far as money, arms, ammunition, and strategic guidance were concerned. The SACP's position was strengthened at the ANC's Kabwe conference in 1985, when a new party leadership was elected, leading to a takeover of communists in the ANC. This only strengthened the resolve of the National Party, or the NP government at the time, not to negotiate with the ANC in an attempt to prevent the country from becoming communist. This changed on 2 February 1990, when F.W. de Klerk made the announcement I mentioned. However, a lesser known but exceptionally important piece of South African history happened in the months between the fall of the Berlin Wall in November 1989 and the withdrawal of apartheid legislation in February 1990. I refer here to the paper published by the South African Communist Party Secretary General Joe Slovo in January 1990. Slovo was a devout communist and in important ways both the intellectual and strategic leader of the ANC SACP alliance. His seminal paper was published under the heading Has Socialism Failed? In Has Socialism Failed?, Slovo reflects on the fall of the Berlin Wall, the collapse of the Soviet Union, and the mainstream interpretation that communism has been defeated. Slovo disagreed with much of the interpretation of these events, but felt obliged to agree that the future of socialism is indeed bleak. With this in mind, the paper elaborates on what went wrong with the pursuit of communism and the strategic changes that had to be made in order to ensure a future for communism. Slovo makes it clear what he means by communism and socialism, that socialism is the road toward communism. As far as his communist objectives are concerned, it is as radical as one can expect from the leader of the Communist Party. The paper celebrates the achievements of communist countries, such as the Soviet Union, Cuba, Venezuela, and others, in improving living conditions in ways that, according to Slovo, far outperformed the capitalist West. In his own words, South Africa had to be transformed into a socialist state in which the state would be controlled by a dictatorship of the proletariat, having control of property and complete mastery and control over social forces. This implied reorganizing social life as a whole by pushing socialist liberation forces into power with the SACP acting as vanguard of the movement. The ultimate goal, he re-emphasized, was to create a socialist South Africa. Slovo's major problem, however, was that he wanted to achieve all of these at a time when support and tolerance for communism and socialism was at an all-time low. And herein lies Slovo's genius. I want to take a moment to thank you for watching and following the content on this channel. And I also want to encourage you to like this video and to subscribe to this channel to ensure that our audience is broadened. Even though his ideals and objectives were as radical as always, the means put forth by Slovo to achieve this was remarkably moderate. Has Socialism Failed can thus be summarized as a call for radical goals to be achieved through moderate means. For this reason, Slovo spent some time to explain why Stalinism ought to be rejected as a form of socialism that has become too bureaucratic and too focused on the leader as opposed to the people. If communism has a future, it ought to be implemented properly, he said. In his own words, the term Stalinism is used to denote the bureaucratic authoritarian style of leadership of parties both in and out of power, which denuded the party and the practice of socialism of most of its democratic content and concentrated power in the hands of a tiny self-perpetuating elite. Close quote. The essential content of Stalinism, he explained, was socialism without democracy. This gap between the leaders and the led provided openings for the enemies of socialism to divide and conquer and to destroy the system from within. As a result, people lost faith in the socialist solution, despite the fact that the theory of communism remains just as valid as it has always been. He says, "We believe, however, that the theory of Marxism in all its essential respects remains valid and provides an indispensable theoretical guide to achieve a society free of all forms of exploitation of person by person. The major weaknesses that have emerged in the practice of socialism are the results of distortions and misapplications." Close quote. Presenting Stalinism as a misapplication of socialism prompted him to conclude that people ought not to lose faith in socialism, as real socialism has not yet been tried. The strategy put forth by Slovo was to present communism and socialism as the means of achieving it in much more moderate terms in order to gain higher levels of approval, but also to gain incremental progress as opposed to attempting to achieve too much in too little time. In this sense, the most important component is to reposition the communist project from an anti-democratic one to one that seeks to promote its goals using democracy as a vessel. And as a result, he regarded Gorbachev's reform projects of Glasnost and Perestroika as necessary, but also as too little, too late. Slovo even went as far as saying that communists ought not to take their ideological founding fathers, especially Marx, Lenin, and Engels, as gospel, because they were not infallible and they were not always correct in their projections. By no means should this be interpreted, however, as a concession by Slovo that socialism is not the solution. The fault lies with us, not with socialism, he argued. In his argument for democratic socialism, Slovo made sure to caution against the temptation to implement a single-party democracy, as he did not regard such a measure as sustainable. The only sustainable solution is to opt for multi-party democracy based on individual rights, but to ensure that the government remains committed to socialist ideals, using democracy as a vehicle for the implementation of socialism. In presenting his argument, Slovo gave new impetus to an important part of the ANC strategy called the National Democratic Revolution. The NDR, as it is called, has been described in many of the ANC and SACP's internal policy documents and could be described as its central strategy. It could be argued that no one has done as much as Slovo to shape the NDR into what it has become. At its core, the NDR is about following a gradual path towards turning South Africa into a socialist state by achieving incremental victories. Broadly speaking, and somewhat oversimplified, it can be described as a strategy of presenting the path towards socialism as a series of phases to be followed, with two major phases identified from the outset. Phase 1 is to do what ought to be done in order to gain control of the levers of power. In Slovo's analysis, this implied presenting the Socialist Alliance as a moderate, freedom-loving movement interested in democracy and individual human rights. In doing so, the movement receives a flood of international approval, while its opponents are increasingly discredited, strengthening the movement in its resolve to implement socialism. Slovo was not as concerned as many of his fellow communists about the prospect of using liberal democracy to promote socialism, as he regarded the system as one that could easily be taken over and used to promote socialist ideals. The second phase could only be embarked on once the first has been concluded. This implies using the levers of power, over which the movement now has control, to implement more radical socialist policies in order to further the goals of the revolution. Needless to say, this is exactly what the ANC did. In fact, it worked so well that the ANC was arguably the most popular movement across the globe during the 1990s. Therein, the movement had a secret weapon, Nelson Mandela. Mandela, in particular, had received saint-like status as a result of his imprisonment, followed by his public remarks about reconciliation upon his release. Yet, and evidently unbeknown to most of the international community, Mandela remained a member of the South African Communist Party and committed to the goals and ideals of the Communist Party. However, the Overton window during the 1990s was of such that merely mentioning this was responded to as a form of heresy and an attempt to sabotage the liberal project. The ANC dominated the negotiations of the early 1990s and succeeded in its quest to gain control of the levers of power in 1994. Initially, the party did govern fairly moderately, with the exception of the drastic step to fire all the directors general in the various government departments and replace them with unqualified, inexperienced cadres of the liberation movement, as a result of a policy known as cadre deployment. However, 2 years after taking power, the ANC started radicalizing its policies, initially with a wave of racially discriminatory policies against the white minority, which formed the bedrock of the party's economic program. The party went on to implement racialized socialist economic policies under the banner of black empowerment, even though such policies don't do anything to actually empower black people towards economic independence. Then, in 2012, the ANC published a follow-up paper entitled The Second Transition. Therein, the party leadership remarked that the first phase of the revolution has now been successfully concluded and that it now had to transition the country into the second phase. This implied implementing more radical and more openly socialist policy ideas, now that the so-called liberation movement has succeeded in entrenching its control over the levers of power. In the years that followed, South African political discourse was captured by a scourge of destructive policy ideas, always presented under the banner of uplifting society, liberating the people, and so forth. These include, but are not limited to, attempts by the ANC and its alliance partners to change the property rights clause in the South African Constitution to empower the state to confiscate private property without compensation, attempts to implement national health insurance, as they call it, and also the notorious Bella Act, according to which the government seeks to take away key decision-making authorities of school governing bodies and have that authority vested in the state. Today, it seems almost incomprehensible to think that people in the 1990s believed that communism had been defeated. Leftist ideology is everywhere today, more than ever in the policy ideas purported not only by countries such as South Africa that unashamedly seek to promote socialism, but also in Western nations that, on the face of it, are quick to declare that they aren't socialist. Marxism in the 21st century has taken a different shape and form than the Maoism, Stalinism, and Nazism of the 20th century. Yet, it remains alive and well, and in important ways, it seems to be making more progress today than it did half a century ago. This is because Marxism has redefined itself by successfully blending in with other ideologies that present itself as theoretically irreconcilable with the communist project. These include liberal democracy, postmodernism, and, as ironic as it might seem, capitalism. Today, Marxism is evident not only in liberal democratic movements and postmodernist ideology, but also in wealthy transnational corporations and international forums. Marxism is alive and well. If you are a Marxist and you want to thank someone for the remarkable transformation that the Marxist movement has undergone since the collapse of the Soviet Union, you should thank Joe Slovo. If you would like to support this channel and the work that we are doing at Lex Libertas to work toward a more sustainable and a more viable political dispensation for South Africa, I would like to encourage you to sign up as a contributor by clicking on the link in the description.